Hello everyone and welcome to the Scottish Smallholder Festival's bird flu update for 2021. This talk will allow you to find all of the information that you need and will also go through the gist of what the information is going to tell you when you find it. The last couple of years we have seen an increase in small-scale poultry keepers. Some of these people haven't kept poultry before, and they may not know that because these birds are in contact with wild reservoirs of disease, it can be a little bit different than just keeping your normal pets or starting up your normal small-scale business with perhaps other types of animals. Sometimes these birds are pets, but they are always still classified as food animals, and they all are subject to the legislation pertaining to food animals because of that. So there is that distinction to be made. They might never be used for laying or for meat, but if they are backyard poultry, they are still classified as food animals. There can sometimes be a lack of contact with the useful organisations and sources of news that most farmers and lifelong crofters and experienced smallholders might already have. So if you have just got yourself some backyard poultry relatively recently and you haven't had any kind of farm animals before, then this might mean that you're not aware of some various places that you can get good, solid information. Of course, it always starts with your vets, but there's also the Animal and Plant Health Agency who are responsible for looking into any potential notifiable diseases, and we'll cover what that means. And if you do find any dead wild birds, there is the DEFRA helpline to report that as well. Where you could find updates on the situation, again, your vet, Scotland Rural College will periodically put out information such as this. The Animal and Plant Health Agency, again, absolutely the first point of contact for any problems with notifiable diseases. We have a farm advisory service in Scotland as well, FAS, and you can look on their website for any news if you just Google Farm Advisory Service Scotland. And really importantly, there's the Scottish Government website, and there's also the gov.uk website for the whole of the UK. You can search for various topics in those websites, and we'll go through how to do that. Registering your poultry can sometimes really help, just because it means that the statutory authorities are going to know where you are if there is a problem in your area so that they can get in contact with you. And we'll also cover how to go about doing that. So what is a notifiable disease? Well, for backyard poultry, there's only two in the UK. One of them is called Newcastle disease, but the one that we're obviously really thinking about right now is bird flu, avian influenza. This is an example of a couple of posters that have been produced by the Scottish Government and various other partners, as you can see in the logos. And it just covers how to protect your birds from the risks of bird flu, because you can get it brought in by wild birds. Unfortunately, it can result in some very sick birds or dead birds, which is why it's such a serious disease. So it's really important to think about your cleaning, about what you do with your feed, and about how you keep birds separate from any potential cause of disease. And of course, constantly staying aware in case there's any updates as to whether or not there is an outbreak of bird flu in your area. Now, the gov.scot website, if you go to /avianinfluenza, which is also on the bottom of the poster there on the right, that's the front page, and that is a good place to start. It'll give you options for various bits and pieces to do with avian influenza in Britain, what the risk level is currently, links to how you can go about making sure that your birds are biosecure. So effective biosecurity, that means making sure that you keep your birds separate from any risk of disease. And it's all about hygiene, it's about cleanliness, it's about keeping food and bedding safe and so on. And it also, as you can see in the middle there, it has the number for the DEFRA National Telephone Helpline for if you find any wild birds. So at the moment, the classification is if you find a single dead wild waterfowl, a single dead bird of prey, or 5 or more dead wild birds of any species, you can report that to the National Telephone Helpline. And if DEFRA believe that warrants investigation and sampling for avian influenza, for bird flu, they will send somebody out to collect that carcass. You don't touch these dead birds yourself. You just want to report them, let them know where it is, and if it's appropriate, they will get that tested for you. This is really useful to know if you find any wild dead birds on your premises and you're concerned about that. There's also the gov.uk website. So the difference is gov.scot is the Scottish Government website. They've got their front page on avian influenza. And then there's also the gov.uk avian influenza website, because I know that we do have listeners who come in from all across the UK. There's a good comprehensive list of various advice and updates on the latest situation. And also some of those pages are linked to directly from the gov.scot website as well. And when I say search, you can use the little magnifying glass at the top of the gov.uk website, but you can also, if you're using a search engine, just Google or Bing or whatever, you can put in gov.uk avian influenza or gov.scot avian influenza, and it should take you to the correct page. So the problem that we have really during the winter months particularly is the fact that bird flu can spread through being carried by migratory birds. And some of these birds will be very sick, but some of these birds do not show the same sort of symptoms that our backyard poultry sometimes do. So they have varying susceptibility to showing illness, which means that actually a bird that isn't very susceptible to showing illness could carry that virus quite a long way. So as you can see, it really does cover many, many different countries right across the world. And if an avian influenza outbreak arises at one point on the migratory pathway, then it can certainly be carried right the way across various continents and land up in your backyard, unfortunately. It's a virus. Most strains mainly affect birds. As we said, it was a notifiable disease. A notifiable disease is one that you must contact and inform the APHA, the Animal and Plant Health Agency, it's your local field office, if you believe that some illness that you're seeing could be bird flu. It's an offence not to. If you're worried, your first point of contact should be your vet. So by worried, I mean if you're starting to see an outbreak of illness in your birds, you really should speak to your vet in the first instance. As we said, this virus can be carried by wild birds. It can be carried into buildings on objects as well. So we're thinking footwear, we're thinking vehicles, that kind of thing. And it can certainly affect either small or large flocks. When you do hear about it in the news, the strains are named for the type of H and N proteins that are on the surface of the viruses, so that's what that means. And different strains of bird flu have different behaviour. The different behaviour we refer to is one type of bird flu is called high pathogenic, and that means very serious, very obviously serious. And then there's low pathogenic, so that has a lower ability to cause disease. So high pathogenic is more obviously serious straight away. It's often fatal. There is a big long list of potential signs that you might see, but some of them include swollen head, a blue neck or throat, not eating as much, gaping, coughing, sneezing, gurgling, rattling, really bubbly kind of discharge at the nose, diarrhea, a drop in the number of eggs laid. You'll certainly risk seeing quite a substantial amount of deaths in birds. And unfortunately, ducks and geese are not always as obvious with it. So if you have mixed birds on your premises, if you've got waterfowl such as ducks and geese, and you have chickens, the disease could establish in your ducks and geese and pass to your chickens before you even realise that something's wrong. The low pathogenic strains, They appear less serious. They are still notifiable. It's still very important to let people know about this. They may not show as much. So you might see mild breathing problems or reduced egg production. So you can see that one of the reasons that there isn't such a definitive list of potential signs of bird flu is because it's very long. They won't always have all of these, so it could be a selection box of a couple of different types of those symptoms. They're not necessarily going to show everything all at once. So there's a variety of different things that it could look like, which is why it's so important to speak to your vet if you do suspect any illness. That's the gov.uk website, which has a list of all the potential signs that you might see with this disease, and as you can see, it's quite extensive. It's spread from bird to bird, so that might be poultry to poultry, or it might be your waterfowl to poultry, or it could be wild birds to your birds. It's spread in their body fluids and their feces, so coughing, sneezing, feces, that kind of thing. It's not airborne over large distances, so you may have come across some diseases that can travel on the wind in previous outbreaks of serious disease in other animals. That's not necessarily the case with bird flu. It can travel on contaminated clothing, contaminated equipment, walking through feces outside. So if you have a lot of wild birds that are hanging out in your yard and then you're tracking that feces into your chicken enclosures or your bird housing, then that's a potential way to spread. There are easy, sort of quick biosecurity guides on the gov.scot avian influenza website. So what we have here is we have a link to a summary poster that you can stick on the wall to help you with your with remembering all the things that you want to check on every day. There is also at the side of the web page, there is a sort of list of chapters to the avian influenza section, and you've got a biosecurity chapter, and that will go in much greater depth about exactly what hygiene and what separation and what storage you need to do to keep your chickens safe. And if you scroll right down to the bottom of that page, there is also another biosecurity link there. So it's just really knowing which links are available, because it's quite easy to read through a web page without realizing that there are certain areas that you can click on to get yourself to the information that you need. But certainly there's a few different links on the front page for avian influenza that will tell you in much greater detail what the requirements are and how to keep your birds safe. At the moment, we're under a prevention zone, so that can sometimes change as well. The requirements for prevention zone can sometimes be updated. So on the front page for the avian influenza on the gov.scot website, there is a section for the latest situation. So if you hear through the news or through a mail shot or a notice board that there has been an update in prevention zone requirements, then you can find the latest situation straight away on the front page of the gov.scot website. When you do get to the next page, there's the full requirements of the avian influenza prevention zone listed under a link. I would say that the most common question that people ask me as a vet is basically, you know, what am I supposed to do? What are the requirements for me at the moment? And you have to remember that this is quite a dynamic situation because those can change, and it is very important to know exactly what the latest story is. So you can certainly get all of the latest requirements under the avian influenza prevention zone tabs. And then if you scroll right down to the bottom of that page that tells you all about the latest situations, for those of us that are a little bit more visual, or those of us who are not aware of where all the outbreaks might be, there's a really handy interactive map right there at the bottom. Obviously links to pages describing the outbreaks in England and Wales as well, but there is an interactive map which I find very handy just to see exactly what's going on. So that's the current map from this morning. It tells you exactly where the outbreaks are, and also details the various sort of zones around the outbreaks. Now, you might have heard on the news that there is a protection zone, a surveillance zone, and sometimes a restricted zone as well. And that can let you know roughly how far away your premises is from an outbreak. So you can zoom that map in. You can see if your village or your premises is within any of those zones that you will need to contact the Animal and Plant Health Agency, your local APHA field office, just to find out what you should be doing and what the requirements are on you. And unfortunately, this year, we're really seeing them pop up in a lot of different places very, very quickly. It is so far shaping up to be quite a bad year with regard to outbreaks of bird flu. These will detail the outbreaks of bird flu in poultry, poultry, game birds, kept birds, that kind of thing. It doesn't actually detail where the wild birds that have tested positive have been found, just because we have to assume that any wild birds in any area are, of course, a risk because they can cover such big distances that there's no point in saying, oh well, you know, there's a wild bird being found in X county that's positive, but that's nowhere near me, because they really can spread all over the place. And there will be an awful lot of wild birds that just aren't found that do have the bird flu as well. So when we talk about biosecurity, some of the requirements that you're going to see detailed are using DEFRA approved disinfectants, which can be confusing for people. So we'll go through what that means. Sometimes, depending on the number of birds that you have or the stage of an outbreak that we're in, you might be required to have boot depths at the entrance and exit of your poultry housing or poultry runs. Car wheels, you may be required, depending on the setup that you have in your holding, you may be required to disinfect your car wheels or any vehicle wheels that are coming into the area. And housing is a potential for a housing order, which can sometimes require compulsory housing. We're not at that stage just yet, but that certainly could happen at any point, so do keep up with the news. Storage of bedding. So you want to make sure that your bedding is stored in such a way that vermin and that wild birds can't get into it or can't poop on it. So for example, bins for your storage of bedding before you use it. Food and water supply, both storage before you're putting it in with the birds and while it's in with the birds. You really want to make sure that when you have food and water out for your birds, that wild birds can't access that. So even if at the moment you have them out in runs and things like that, try and make sure that the food and water is located in a covered location that your birds can access, that isn't readily accessible by wild birds and also vermin. So that picture there is an example of a covered feeder that only opens when something the weight of a chicken stands on it. There are other options, obviously. So just have a little think about exactly how you're going to fulfill a requirement to make sure that there's as little contact between the food and water and wild birds and vermin as you possibly can. Covered runs are good if that's something that you can achieve. Obviously, if we do end up with a housing order, then that becomes much more of a necessity. But it's a good to have even when we're not required to house poultry. And try and make sure that if you do have a run or you are putting your feed and water in a particular location, it's a good idea to try and keep it away from trees or anywhere that wild birds might perch naturally, because those areas are especially contaminated just with the wild birds sitting in the trees or roosting in the trees, and then there's a buildup of infectious material, feces and so on underneath that tree. So for you, it means thinking about your boots, your equipment, your clothing, your visitors. You don't necessarily want people who keep chickens coming across right after they've dealt with their chickens wearing the same clothes and then going in with your chickens. That's something I would definitely try to avoid. It means thinking about vehicles. Do they go anywhere near where the poultry are? Is there a possibility of transfer of disease on tires and things? And you do need to start thinking about how potentially to house or if not at all possible, otherwise keep separate, which is the usual wording for a housing officer. You must house, or only if not at all possible, otherwise keep separate your birds from wild birds, because there is a possibility of a housing order coming along, as we have seen in previous years. And part of the consideration for that is having the equipment to house your poultry if you need to, but also thinking about how you're going to mitigate the stress of that if your birds are really used to moving about freely in a much, much larger area. So you might want to start thinking about your sheds, your garages, covered runs, any polytunnels that are empty for the winter, any lean-tos that you have that might be easy to clean out. You want to be thinking about what infrastructure you have on your holding or around your house that might be possible to convert into temporary chicken housing if there's a sudden housing order, and if your current setup doesn't really fit the requirements of keeping your birds completely separate from wild birds. If we do get there to a housing order, it's immediate compulsory housing for chickens, turkeys and ducks. Where it's not practical, complete separation from contact with wild birds as much as possible. You're really looking at, for example, the picture at the bottom there. You think that you've got separation there from wild birds, but that little house is right under some trees, so there is going to be a bit more of a contaminated area. On the plus side, they do have a cover, obviously, over the run, which does help, and the food and water is inside. It doesn't appear that those birds are getting out to free range. So those are considerations that you might see in various different setups, is try not to put them in a contaminated area, even if they are covered. And obviously with housing orders, you are starting to think about covering rather than the possibility of having an open mesh roof to a run, which can allow feces to drop in. With geese, game birds and other birds, previously the wording has suggested to take practical steps to keep separate. Keeping species separate is one that people don't always consider. As I've said, geese and ducks might not show the same signs of illness that chickens and turkeys would. So they could carry the disease without you realising, and then if you give them the opportunity to mix with your chickens or turkeys, then you can suddenly get quite an explosive outbreak of disease. And of course, at the moment, with the prevention zone, we don't have a housing order just yet, but we are required to practice good biosecurity. That is a requirement of the prevention zone. We are required to try and keep wild birds and their droppings separate from food and water and bedding and so on, as we've discussed. There's a really detailed handout available, so something that I could never get through in just a talk. If you search gov.UK Biosecurity Poultry Guide, just in any search engine, that should take you to that big long link there at the top. And it is very, very comprehensive. It will tell you absolutely everything that you need to know about biosecurity and good hygiene for captive birds inside prevention zones. There are fact sheet summary handouts for small flocks as well. As we've shown you, there's a link on the gov.scot UK website to the posters, just to give you a reminder. People ask me a lot about whether or not their disinfectant is DEFRA approved, because we are required to use DEFRA approved disinfectants when we've got the suspicion of bird flu outbreaks in the UK, and we're under a prevention order. So for that, you can check your disinfectant by searching gov.uk DEFRA approved disinfectants, and that will send you to that link at the bottom there. You can check the disinfectant you're currently using. You can phone your local farm supplies place and you can ask them what disinfectants they have. They should hopefully be able to tell you if those are DEFRA approved disinfectants. And it's not just about the disinfectant. There are certain dilution rates that we should be using, and all of that information is on that link on the website. So because it's something that you can never remember absolutely everything about, you really do need to sort of check out the graph and check out the list, because there's far too many of them. That's a brilliant resource, which is also updated as necessary. to make sure it keeps you right. Registering your poultry, you must register poultry flocks of 50 or more, but I know a lot of people will have far less than that. You don't have to have more than 50 to register. You can register voluntarily with far fewer chickens or ducks or whatever you have than that. So you have to register if you're over 50, and that's any eligible birds. So if you've got a mixed flock and you've maybe only got 20 chickens, but you've got 20 ducks and you've got 20 geese, then that puts you over the threshold. If you do have fewer than 50, you want to just pop off to that link there. Again, you can just go to the gov.uk website and search for poultry registration. It should take you to that link. It applies to chickens, including bantams, turkeys, ducks, geese, pheasants, partridges, quail and guinea fowl, pigeons if they're reared for meat, and also I have had the occasional query about some rarer birds. It does also apply to ostriches, emus, rheas and cassowaries. Don't see too many of them. Certainly have seen a couple of smallholders with rheas, just being smaller and a bit more manageable. So what that does is it allows the APHA, allows the Animal and Plant Health Agency to know where you are, and it means that you've given them your contact details. So if an outbreak does occur in your area, then they are able to contact you directly. They know you're there and they're able to say, look, this is what's happening in your area, here's what our advice is. And that can really help, rather than just hearing what's going on through the grapevine and then frantically searching for information yourselves. So the important thing really is to be prepared and not worried at the last minute. We should all be practicing biosecurity at the moment, the required biosecurity. So DEFRA approved disinfectants, making sure your food and your bedding is separate from wild birds and vermin, making sure that you're keeping your birds as safe as possible, that they don't have any contact with birds on other premises, or that people from other premises who've been in contact with their birds don't immediately then come over and have contact with your birds. All of these things that we've covered, we should all be doing that just now because that is a requirement of the prevention zone. We are all going to have to be prepared for the possibility of a housing order as well, because that is something that obviously has happened in the past when we've had bird flu outbreaks and prevention zones in place. So we really could do with thinking about that. And I find, especially from the stress point of view, you want to be thinking about enrichment and hanging up, for instance, different types of food that allow them to peck, chicken toys. You can find all of these things either ready-made, which is a bit more expensive, or you can find them sort of homemade DIY type ideas. All of the things that might assist your chickens if they're suddenly confined to a smaller space. We want to be thinking about that, not least where we're going to put them. So hopefully that has been a help to everybody. The most important thing really, I think, is knowing where to find the information, because the thing is, even if you just hear somebody tell you all of the information, it can change. So knowing where to find the updates and knowing where to find us changing information on the current situation is really, really important. And hopefully that has directed you to all of the right places. And just to let you know that this presentation was funded by the Scottish Government as part of its Public Good Veterinary Advisory Services programme. And if anybody has any questions, then certainly the organisers of the Scottish Smallholder Festival can pass on any queries as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you all feel much more equipped to deal with these situations, especially if you are a new keeper.